Well, kia ora koutou. Welcome everybody to tonight's Burns lecture. My name is Chris, and I have the privilege of introducing Canon, Canon Dr. Cathy Ross. And as many of you know, the title of the series is Mission as an Adventure of the Imagination. And tonight, Cathy will be presenting on mission and whiteness. For those of you who don't know Cathy, just a very, very, very brief bio. She works with the Church Missionary Society in Oxford and is also lecturer in mission at Regent's Park College, Oxford. And it is my great delight to welcome her now. So please come forward, Cathy.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your warm welcome. As Chris said, tonight's lecture is on mission and whiteness, a fellowship of the unlike. And you're going to start by doing a bit of drawing, actually. So those of you who are online, you will need pen and paper. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to do this exercise. It's only for you. You don't have to show it to anybody or talk to anyone about it, so relax. It's just for you. You can cover your paper if you need to. But we will come back to it briefly at the end, again, just for you to look at. So to start off, could you take your piece of paper and draw 5, actually. I couldn't get an image of 5. But 5 concentric circles, so it looks like that. 4 or 5. For those of you at home, this is what you'll need to do. Pen and paper and 4 or 5 concentric circles, please. And then I'll tell you what. They'll need to be big enough to write, that's fine, to write some words in. And we'll just do it quite quickly and briefly. Don't overthink it, otherwise we'll be here for too long. So have you done your 5 circles? So in the first circle, write one word that best describes you. One word that best describes you. And then in the second circle, write 2 more words that best describe you, who you are. And then in the third circle, write 3 more. And you've probably got the drill by now. In the fourth circle, write 4 more. And if you have enough words left, in the fifth circle, write up to 5 more, describing you. And this is not to show anyone, it's only for your own personal viewing. So I'll give you 1 more minute. Don't overthink it. Okay, if you haven't finished, don't worry. I asked you to do this exercise because I think it's revealing and it shows us something of our own context, our own complexities, and perhaps our own unfinished agendas. For example, I wonder how many of you put woman or man in the inner circles, or white or black, or able-bodied or differently abled, or heterosexual, or gay. So I borrowed this exercise from British Afro-Caribbean theologian Anthony Reddy, who's used it many times. I've used it a few times. And we have both noticed that minority groups or groups who experience marginalisation or othering or even invisibility usually do name that in one of their inner circles, while those who are normalised do not. So recently I used this with a group of students, and not a single male student noted that he was a man in any circle, whereas all the women did. Anthony has noticed the same with those other realities I mentioned. If you're able-bodied, you probably neither notice nor note that down. But if you're differently abled, you might. Or if you're white, you probably don't notice that or write it down, but if you're black, you may do, and so on. So I think that this exercise points to not only our own inner complexities, our own personal realities and locatedness or context, the reality of our own human condition, but also it can alert us to the systemic and structural injustices in which we are embedded and enmeshed, such as being a woman in a patriarchal world, or being a black person in a world of white privilege, or being gay in a cisgendered world, and so on. These unjust systems and structures can make it hard for us to notice, or to be attentive, or to see clearly. Indeed, systems and structures want to blind us, or to make us indifferent to injustice in its many forms: economic, racial, sexual, class, etc. For example, we might not notice that if we're white, we benefit from centuries of white privilege. Or if we're male, we benefit from being the norm, the default setting. Or if we're able-bodied, we just don't even think about how we're going to navigate the world. Or if we're straight, what that might mean for our gay friends to be in church, which seems to be the least loving and accepting place sometimes. Or if we're middle class, just how patronising and unaware we can come across. So maybe it's easy to blame systems and structures. Principalities and powers, we blithely say, and nod wisely. I have done this myself. And I agree that there are principalities and powers at work, and that sometimes there seems to be a kind of evil unleashed that is humanly incomprehensible and seems to take over. Think of the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what's going on in Sudan at the moment. Perhaps those are extreme examples though. So then let's think in a UK context with which I am more familiar, but I imagine it's similar here. Let's think of the years asylum seekers can spend waiting in the system for their case to be heard, or the months and years it can take for people in the welfare system to get the benefits they're entitled to the unequal access to the education system, the postcode lottery for the healthcare system in Britain, the lack of representation of women and people in colour in leadership in any institution. But who are these systems and institutions? Who are they? Well, to a large extent, they're us, aren't they? These systems and institutions. We are involved, and we perpetuate the evil, the violence, the injustice, and the indifference. We are part of these systems and structures and institutions that allow such injustices to be perpetuated. So like many of you, I began to see this in stark relief during the pandemic. We all know how the pandemic has opened up the cracks and exposed the inequalities and injustices that were already there. It has forced us to face these inequalities and injustices in our world, the injustices and inequalities of our systems and in our lives, and I think it's been a wake-up call. And it was a wake-up call for me, particularly in one area, that of racial justice, and I would like to explore this with you now. So in some ways, I've been thinking about issues of race all my life. I am from here. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I was born here. I was brought up in Auckland. Tamaki Makaurau, I think it's called now, is that right? So I was brought up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where 15% of our population is Māori. As a child, so I'm older than most of you, but as a child at primary school, I can remember learning stick games and poi dances, as if these were rituals of some exotic culture, some other culture and tribe. while there were Māori children in the classroom, sitting next to me. I mean, looking back, it seems othering and quite frankly bizarre. We know that we Pākehā are the manuhiri, the incomers, the guests, while Māori are the tangata whenua, the people of the land. And I do think that despite that, growing up here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Māori worldview has had an impact on how I see myself in relation to land, Indigenous cultures and other people. It has shaped who I am in our culture in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then more recently, the emergence of Black Lives Matters also raised my awareness even further. And so I started reading intentionally around race, books, blogs and podcasts. And I'm going to show you some of the books I read. I hope this doesn't look too show-offy, but this is in the last few years, not just in the last few months. So these are books that have a very British focus, but or a North American focus, but a focus around race. And these are some of the books that I read. And one area that had a huge impact on me was the slave trade. So of course I knew about the slave trade and its horrors, but actually it was only after reading that book Brit-ish, in the middle there, the yellow one, by Afua Hirsch, who's a Ghanaian Brit. In 2018, I read that book, that I started to think, what does it do to you to know that your ancestors were slaves? Actually, that book was such a great book, I gave it to our kids for Christmas and insisted that they read it. If you are black and British, you also suffer a kind of double jeopardy, because it was only in 2015, that our taxes in Britain stopped paying off the compensation offered to slave owners in the 19th century. In 2015. Did you know that? I didn't know that. I thought, how is this even possible? How have I not known this? In 2015, our taxes stopped paying off the compensation to the slave owners, not the slaves who got nothing. And then I thought, well, it's okay. I'm a Kiwi. I'm not part of this. This is the Brits' problem. British Empire. But then I thought, Aotearoa New Zealand was part of the British Empire. And some of our wealth and development will be a direct result of the slave trade. And certainly, Māori suffered under colonialism. Now, that might be a bit of a segue from slave trade to colonialism, but I think there are some connections. Much of their land was taken, their language was banned for a period in the 1930s, their customs and culture were othered and exoticised. It was the first CMS missionaries who transliterated the language and introduced the printing press, so made publications in Māori possible. There's also the Anglican Church, led by Bishop Selwyn at the time, who refused to ordain Māori clergy until they could speak Greek and Hebrew. But you all know more about this than me. And then two further encounters challenged me in this area of racial justice during this COVID period. One was reading After Whiteness by Willie James Jennings and other works by him. And the other was the daily meetups with our neighbours during the various lockdowns. I've forgotten how many lockdowns we had in Britain now, but I think it was at least 3. And the first one was for 3 months, and it was very strict. So I'm going to start with neighbours and meeting them during this first lockdown. So that was the first encounter that confronted me. Being forced to stay at home, so we had to stay at home. We were allowed out once a day for a walk, and that was it. So being forced to stay at home and to stay local challenged me in unexpected ways, as you could only meet up one-to-one or in very small groups. We slightly stretched the definition with our neighbours. So this smallness meant that we experienced life and a level of intimacy that we did not know before. So during that first lockdown, with a group of neighbours, I live in it's a typical sort of British housing estate, and our houses are all pretty close to each other, but there's a big open sort of driveway area in front of all the houses. So during the first lockdown, I met with my neighbours every day at 2 o'clock. So every day at 2 o'clock, whoever wanted to, everyone was home because there was nowhere else to go. Whoever wanted to came outside and we met together for a cup of tea. My son said to me, "What did you talk about every day?" But we managed to find things to talk about. We shared much of life together. We were vulnerable, tearful, open, honest, and hospitable, even with the many restrictions. We shared our struggles and joys together. We offered and received hospitality, comfort, and support. We know that hospitality is a good metaphor for mission. I've already talked about that with its ambiguity and fluidity of host and guest challenging many of our understandings of reciprocity, power and gift. I discovered that I needed my neighbours. I needed their human companionship, as my husband was working long hours at the medical centre most days. He was still going to work as a medical doctor. I discovered sharing, mutuality, the enriching of community, because we'd been pushed into a place of seeing our need of the other and the incompleteness of our own self-sufficiency. It felt like we were learning what it meant to be human together, and these seem to be key principles in mission. And it's made me wonder, well, why was it ever like this before the pandemic? Well, I guess there are some obvious reasons. I was travelling to work, I was travelling around the world. I actually never took much effort to get to know my neighbours. I was polite but distant. I was too busy to get involved. And until now, I've never really thought very attentively about Jesus' second commandment. Does he literally mean love your neighbour as in the person next door? Probably yes, certainly in his context and in his day. So this might be my first challenge. The missionary frontier, as former CMS General Secretary Bishop John Taylor rather quaintly put it, is literally 5 steps away, the number of steps to my nearest neighbour's front door. And neighbours are always there. In fact, you may see your neighbours more than your own extended family. Neighbours can interrupt you, they can demand things from you. You actually can't avoid them unless you choose to. And this encounter with my neighbours challenged me because of our own diversity. As a group of neighbours, we represented other ethnicities and nationalities, as well as other faiths or none. So diversity has many faces: cultural, racial, ethnic, gender, sexuality, differently abled, age, class, to name some. And the pandemic unmasked and revealed starkly these diversities. And precisely because of our diversity and the racism one of our number experienced, Black Lives Matter and racism became a key area for discussion. Recent publications have also alerted us yet again to our lack of awareness with respect to racial diversity, our institutional racism, and our white fragility. And so I had some very uncomfortable conversations with our neighbours during our daily meetups. And then towards the end of the first lockdown, I read After Whiteness by African-American theologian Willie James Jennings. I read this as part of a DTH reading group with the University of Roehampton, and afterwards I devoured a lot of other stuff by him: articles, lectures, podcasts, webinars. And he used a metaphor which became a kind of light bulb moment for me in seeing the world. Possession, control, and mastery is his metaphor. And suddenly the world and how we have engaged in it made a lot of sense to me. So let me try to explain this to you. So in his book, After Whiteness, Jennings claims that the role of theological education in particular is to cultivate belonging. But he explains that theological education has become instead an exercise in mastery. And it's a plantation metaphor. So literally, he says, it was the master training the master's son to run the plantation efficiently, to maintain order, to categorise, to delimit, define, maximise the efficient use of slaves' bodies. However, he offers some hope by stating that theological education has within it the resources to reframe Western education beyond this distortion. The first is, so he uses this image. According to Jennings, there are 2 things that form this distortion. And the first one is this: a white self-sufficient man has self-sufficiency defined by possession, control, and mastery. The second is that many respond to this image by promoting a homogeneity that aims towards a cultural nationalism. This then results in hegemony, in homogeneity, power or authority, and sameness, neither of which are gospel values, and can lead us towards an individualised faith and a utilitarian education and away from diversity. Furthermore, Jennings explains, and this is important, that white self-sufficient masculinity, which is the phrase he uses, does not necessarily refer to a particular person, but rather it's the way of organising life that distorts our identity and the possibility of a richer life together. And moreover, whiteness does not even necessarily refer to skin colour, but rather to a way of being in or operating in the world, a way of seeing the world and inhabiting the world. Therefore, when theological education becomes an exercise in possession, control and mastery, it sets out to maintain order, to categorise, delimit, define, maximise efficiency and productivity. Maybe this sounds a little bit like the university, full stop. Mission has played its part in this, as it has so often been framed by or located in white colonialism, as this was how colonial masters saw the world. We might call this the pedagogy of plantation, and I think we can see how this has influenced not only our engagement in mission, but also our language. Much of Western mission, and perhaps even church growth, reflects this in its drive for growth, expansion, efficiency, measurement, projects, strategies and numbers. There are targets to meet, business plans and projects to write, strategies to formulate, conversions to count, ever bigger and more expensive conferences to attend. Much of this language and worldview comes from the worlds of military and management, worlds of war, measurement, efficiency, productivity and victory. In fact, there's even a term for this, managerial missiology, a cold reductionist term which dehumanises mission. And 20 years ago, Peruvian missiologist Samuel Escobar critiqued this back in 2003. He wrote, "What I am seeing in the application of these concepts in mission is that missionaries depersonalise people into unreached targets, making them objects of hit-and-run efforts to get decisions that may be reported." Jennings explains how colonialism meant that whiteness was projected onto the world. European Christians and missionaries projected a meaning onto the world that was very different from many of the cultures they went to and were living in. They challenged the worldview shared by many Indigenous peoples about their sense of identity, their sense of well-being and relationship with the land, creation and the place, and even the Indigenous languages. These early Europeans and new places defined, they designated, they divided ancient tribal groupings. Rwanda and Burundi is a classic example of that. They created borders with straight lines. Have a look at the borders around Sudan and Algeria. They developed racial categories. They challenged and destroyed the deeply held beliefs and practices of Indigenous peoples. For Indigenous peoples, the place is in them. The place, the land, they are the place, the land, the creation. We know this from Māori culture here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We know this here, where the Māori define themselves according to their place, their mountain, their river or sea, and their tribe. And the Māori word for land, whenua, is the same word for placenta. Māori is the land is them. So Māori understanding of the land contrasts with a European worldview of individual ownership, and one which has so often reduced the land to an inert or utilitarian resource for our own use. This seems to be an extraction or economic worldview, whereas many Indigenous cultures practice a worldview with a more of a gift mentality. Māori theologian J. Martanga writes that the Māori worldview is of a sharing and gift economy, but that when industrialisation was imposed, it was out of sync with our souls. And like most Indigenous peoples around the world, it proved a fast track to poverty. So this plantation metaphor plays out in many ways. In the United States, educational institutions, many of them, are literally built on former plantation land or with endowments from slavery. We know that the same is true in Britain also. In Oxford, some postgrad students have started what they call the Uncomfortable Oxford Tour, Uncomfortable Oxford, founded in 2018 by some postgrad students with the aim of raising questions about the uncomfortable legacies of inequality and imperialism in the city and in the university. They say, we ultimately ask, how can we engage collectively with these histories in the public space? The Uncomfortable Oxford Walking Tour is an excellent way of learning about Oxford's uncomfortable history, including its links with the slave trade. So if you ever visit Oxford, I highly recommend these tours. They've got the classic one, the Uncomfortable Oxford Tour. They also have one on money, they have one on empire, and you can do them online. So if you never get to Oxford, you can sign up and do them online. They cost about $20, I think. So it's an excellent way of learning about empire and some of this uncomfortable history. One of the stops of the Uncomfortable Walking Tour is All Souls College, and there's a picture of it, the doorway there, where its connection to wealth generated from slave plantations in the Caribbean is explained. The college's Codrington Library is named after a plantation owner. And the online tour shows a photo of a young black man outside the college with the words All Slaves College painted on his body. To address this legacy, the college recently created an annual scholarship, 2, I think, for undergrad students from the Caribbean. They also mounted a plaque inside the library. So it's through that door. I don't think you can see the plaque, but it says, in memory of those who worked in slavery on the Codrington plantation in the West Indies. Unfortunately, the plaque is not visible to most people because that door is normally closed. It's not open to the public. This plantation metaphor is more than just an economic worldview. It relates to how we organise the world, how we inhabit our world, a world of efficiency, control, measurement and production for the sake of the master and the master's sons. This, Jennings claims, is replicated in places far removed from the history of the slaveholding USA because we have all been framed in this way. He says, an ecclesial reality inside a white patriarchal domesticity shaped by an overwhelming white presence that always aims to build a national and global future that we should all inhabit. The slave legacy of theological education is deeply embedded in our imaginations and in many of our institutions. It might be harder for you to understand here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but believe me, we can see it in Britain. And if we think it's just, if this is extreme or just a North American problem, think again. We have seen how it's easy to think how this might apply to Oxford and Cambridge, or to theological colleges with their traditions of empire embedded in their architecture, their customs, and their hidden curriculum. But perhaps we could take this a bit more broadly and think, well, what about us and some of our missional instincts and practices? And if we think especially within the context of emerging church or fresh expressions, which I spoke about last week, let's just pause for a moment and ask ourselves a few uncomfortable questions emerging from this analysis. And you'll have to think of resonances for you here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm thinking about this more in a British context, but I'm sure there'll be some overlaps. So are we very white and middle class? Do we sometimes have a kind of saviour complex with our activist approaches and our entrepreneurial mindsets? How diverse are our communities? How different from us are our communities, and who is given leadership in our contexts? Who is invisible? Whose voices are not heard, and who is not present at the table? Sometimes, even in a strong example of an emerging church or fresh expressions, there are still issues. I can think of one community in England where a member told me that he longed for the leader to be more open and more vulnerable. This person would have loved to be able to help the leader. And when thinking about context, good coffee and craft beers may appeal to certain groups, but we know that's only one sector of society. Maybe it's more about jerk chicken and dal, or you'll have to think of what the equivalent is here. What might be the Kiwi equivalent? Do we hang out with the like-minded and sweep people along with us with our own ideas of a future that we should all inhabit, as Jennings refers to? In my own ecclesial context of the Church of England, Black British Anglican priest Azariah France Williams offers a searing critique of institutional racism in the Church of England. His book is a kind of theology from below, prophetic, storytelling, poetic, full of stories, metaphor, anecdote, and imagination. I thought perhaps our theology and missiology could look a bit more like that. He offers some imaginative rereadings of biblical texts using the lens of black theology, and he also imagines some new ways forward. He suggests a truth and reparations commission, which could be a sharing of stories followed by recompense and maybe a relationship. But he also wonders if that would be enough. What would that relationship be based on? He concludes rather bleakly that the Church of England, or the Cross and Crown Club, as he calls it, was not designed for people of colour. He says, if you're ignored for long enough, the social death, the isolation, and the futility of your efforts for change silence you and sentence you to a form of living exile. Things are changing, and with the advent of movements such as Black Lives Matter, Rhodes Must Fall, that was a particularly Oxford thing. Cecil Rhodes is in Oxford. There's the Rhodes Scholarships. I guess you know about this. Rhodes must fall, except he hasn't. His statue is still there on the high street. Me Too, Extinction Rebellion, the momentum around decolonising the curriculum, the discussion about private property and public statues in England that was brought to a head with the former slave trader Edward Colston being unceremoniously dumped in Bristol Harbour. But I note this is a live issue here too. I read in stuff.co.nz, that academic resource. I read in Stuff about the sordid history behind the Wakefield Memorial in the Basin Reserve. Stuff reported that a Ngāti Toa representative wants the memorial removed permanently. Dr. Taku Parai said, those who had a hand in early instruments in colonisation and enacting those for the acquisition of profit and land need to be removed. A lot of that stuff was hugely unfair. Wakefield was part of it. We're talking about the effects of profiteering and the quick demise of our status of mana whenua. Once our people realised the purpose of this regime was to take over our land and impose what a civil society would have looked like, that took us out of the picture. Fans are divided over this. Some wonder what the memorial even is. Some find the actual structure beautiful. Former white firm Penny Kinsella thinks it represents oppression and colonial attitudes. Heritage New Zealand, Carrie Pollock said, interpretation is really important. Heritage listings represent a moment in time, but social attitudes towards something might change. Changing social narratives are part of something's story. So there are no easy answers as to how we deal with our history and interpret it, but we need to have these conversations. We're slowly becoming aware how white privilege and even white supremacy have skewed and distorted theological education and our engagement in mission for so long. My colleague, Malawian missiologist Harvey Kuyani, claims, many white Christians, Jesus, do not know how to relate with black and brown people apart from oppressing them. 600 years of church history can testify. He maintains that mission, as we understand and practice it today, is a European creation, and that we need to learn to engage in mission without an attitude of superiority. One of our students challenged us recently. The interesting thing to me then is just how much this module, Theologies and Global Perspective, is making me question everything. One of the questions I have repeatedly asked in the sessions is why amazing people continue towards improving an institution so clearly steeped in colonialism, patriarchy, and a whole manner of other issues when they could create something new, a contrast community, as Willie James Jennings puts it. All of the speakers have had examples or given glimpses of alternative systems that seem to work better than the time-honoured traditional way of doing things, and yet they continue to seek to be part of and to change the system. For this student, the most exciting alternative they had heard of was the circle of concerned African women theologians, which has been such an important space for women to do theology together communally in Africa. It draws on women from all backgrounds, cultures and religions. It's diverse and it's a loose and flat collective, a really good model. So, are there some ways forward? African-American scholar and social activist Bell Hooks, who died in 2021, and Willie James Jennings both offer ways forward, again with two arresting metaphors or ideas, one eros and the other the crowd. Bell Hooks writes about a passion for learning, which she names as eros. This is not meant in a sexual sense, but rather in terms of an energy or a passion that propels us towards learning as an adventure. She tells us that eros can be a powerfully motivating force and that it can provide an epistemological grounding in forming how we know what we know, and to use such ways to invigorate discussion and to excite the critical imagination. It's an energy that drives us towards discovery and wholeness, as well as towards co-learning and co-creation of knowledge. One student told me recently that she thinks people no longer seek out experts who impart information to them, a master-slave model perhaps, but rather that people prefer to join in learning together. And Jennings believes that theological education has as its fundamental resource erotic power, and that power finds its home in the divine ecstasy in which God relentlessly gives God's self to us, joyfully opening the divine life as our habitation. So I think that's a fine-sounding sentiment, but what does that actually mean? I think that this power can only be entered through participation. And that, I think, is the promise and the challenge. With whom do we participate? Jennings also offers the metaphor of the crowd, and I think that's quite an intriguing one. He says that Jesus attracted crowds and that he often gathered people around him who preferred not to be together. He reminds us of God's power to end hostility and to draw us and all of creation into reconciliation, one that we do not control, but one that will recreate and reform us. And Jennings claims this starts with community, the crowd. So for this to happen, we need to be in shared spaces so that we can share life together. It means gathering together those who may even prefer not to be together. Jennings insists that we must be willing to live towards a different formation of place and space. He says we fight against the segregation that shapes our worlds and we work to weave lives together. And he goes on to explore the concept of forming a contrast community. And he says that these communities must be formed on the actual ground in neighbourhoods and in living spaces. It's in our shared living spaces. It was with my neighbours in lockdown and our meetups and subsequently. It's in our friendships and being together in the same space and in conversations that learning and change can happen. Imagine a learning community who welcomes all across all the lines that might divide us. A contrast community that is formed on the actual ground in neighbourhoods and learning spaces so that we experience the gifts and challenges we can offer one another. So after whiteness means that we need a new discourse and a new posture when it comes to education and to mission. In his book, Multicultural Kingdom, Ethnic Diversity, Mission and the Church, my colleague Harvey Quiani asserts that in our current context in the UK, he says diversity is the new normal. And that our discourse, be it the missional church conversation, the emerging church, missionary congregations or fresh expressions of church, must reflect cultural diversity. So I'd like to conclude with two stories, one from the 19th century and a more contemporary one. Both involve women from Africa. So the first one is about Ibrabina. And this is a story that I discovered from a former CMS General Secretary, Simon Barrington Ward, who narrates this moving story of Ibrahima. She was a prophet, a woman leader and trader in the 1880s in Niger. She had been filled with the Holy Spirit in a mission-led church, a CMS church probably, and she learned how to read from the local CMS missionary so that she could read, translate, and teach the gospel. And this is what Barrington Ward writes. Ibrahima saw in Jesu Christi a new love, a new all-pervasive spirit power, the possibility of a new people, a fellowship of the unlike. Those are my italics. I love that phrase. I feel like this is what Jennings is talking about, the contrast community. A fellowship of the unlike, bonding together all tribes, all ethnic groups, both black and white, into a new society. Here the rich would care for the poor and the strong for the weak, and what was to be a new heaven and a new earth. So a fantastic vision. The movement grew enormously, not only drawing in young people and all ethnic groups. Unfortunately, it also created conflicts with the elders and with the missionaries. And Simon Barrington Ward writes how eventually the CMS missionaries came in to tidy things up, to conform to a tidier colonial mindset. He says, the CMS shaped and trained the new church to fit in with the wider colonial world. A much more individualised, spiritualised faith seemed appropriate, along with a largely utilitarian education. And Ibrahima ended up being a matron in a CMS girls' hostel. But nevertheless, Ibrahima's story gives me hope to embody a new discourse, a new posture, a new action. She came to Christ in a mission context. She lived out her faith in a way appropriate to her own place and space and time, her own context. Yes, it was shut down by the missionaries and a colonial mindset, but it shows it is possible to live out and rejoice in diversity. Indeed, to become a fellowship of the unlike. She was also then, as is perhaps still the case now, sadly, an unlikely leader. She was originally an illiterate woman who led people into a fellowship of the unlike. Where are those leaders among us? Are they even among us? And would we even recognise them if they were? And how are we part of developing fellowships of the unlike in our contexts? How are we intentionally encouraging interaction with difference? And one final story to encourage us to take action. So recently at our postgrad research day, we had Dr. Lisa Ajay speak to us. She works for Christian Aid in the UK, and she spoke to us about racial justice. And she finished by asking us to please stop touching her toes. So I found this to be a very arresting metaphor. What does she mean? Please stop touching my toes. So she explained to us that as a black woman of Ghanaian descent, she is sick and tired of white people offering to, or actually washing the feet of people of colour and wanting to repent. What she wants to see is repentance followed by action and changed behaviour. She exhorted white people to stop touching her feet. And I found this to be a powerful and memorable image and a clarion cry to action. Lisa is one of the co-founders of the Sankofa Collective, a community of Christians committed to racial justice. And Lisa told us about the 4 pillars of their collective, and I thought this might have some resonances for Aotearoa New Zealand. Telling the whole truth about our history, taking time to lament, to repent and forgive, and to change systems. So my colleague Harvey Kuyani then led us in a time of reflection, and he asked us to write down one action we could take as a result of repenting. And one student wrote that he repented of not being angry enough. So I don't think that we can engage in mission today without an awareness of the impact of colonialism and of the impact of colonialism and of the wider context of racism in our society and our world. We then need a willingness to take action. African-American activist and theologian James Cone alerts us to white Christianity's ability to talk abstractly about the love of God whilst simultaneously allowing racism, colonialism, and empire to flourish. He claims that whites do not talk about racism because we do not have to, because of our guilt, and because we do not want to engage with black rage, and because we are not prepared for a radical redistribution of wealth and power. Anthony Reddy does not mince his words when he says, "In critiquing whiteness, I am talking about a thorough deconstruction of the toxic relationship between Christianity, empire, and notions of white British superiority." So to conclude, daily meetups with my neighbours and encountering a powerful metaphor from Willie James Jennings have challenged me to think more deeply about whiteness and racial justice. And my dream is for our learning community at CMS to become a fellowship of the unlike, a contrast community where we learn together across all boundaries. 2 years ago, we introduced a new program for African Christian diaspora students. So we now have 2 parallel programs, one for African diaspora students and one for pioneer students studying mission. And these students share 3/4 of the modules together. So this is beginning to move towards my dream as we learn about our own postures, experience not only our own discomfort, but also the gift of diversity. We are learning what it might mean to have to decolonise our own individualistic pedagogies to become more communal, and perhaps even a contrast community, to decolonise mission education and the curriculum more generally, to move towards reconciliation and justice and multicultural learning, and to frame mission education in terms of hope. So for the last minute, I'd like you to look at your circles again, the circles that you had at the beginning. Do you look at these any differently having heard this? So I'll give you a minute to create an outer circle in which you can write one action that you might take as a result of listening to this. So if you've got room, create an outer circle. If not, just have a look at what you've got there and write one action that you might take as a result of having heard this presentation. Thank you. Just give you a minute.